Hi there and welcome to another post-collection completion review summary type thing here in the Mastertronic Chronicles. Good intro there. So you may or may not know, if you're new to Mastertronic then perhaps you don't, that Mastertronic were a publisher. They never really had any in-house developers. All the games were purchased from other developers and published by Mastertronic under their banner. And we're going to take a look at one of those developers in a bit more detail today, and that's Mr. Chip Software. They were responsible for some of the best games on the Commodore 64 from Mastertronic. If you look back at my top 10, which I did a few days ago, you'll see that 4 of their games were in that top 10. So that's enough of an explanation as to why I'm doing a profile of this developer. They were formed in 1982 by Andrew Morris and Sean Southern. They began working with Mastertronic in 1984. They'd done a few releases by themselves with limited success, but once they started getting published by Mastertronic, their profile and their name really grew. They were also joined by Tony Kelly, who came on board as a second programmer. Sean and Tony did the majority of the programming. Andrew Morris did some of the title screens and graphics. We'll take a look at some of his title screens a little bit later on. So what I'm going to do is go through each of the games that they released in order and just give a little bit of information and show a little bit of gameplay footage for each one. So we're going to start with what were the very first releases from Mastertronic on the Commodore 64, at least if you look at them in terms of the catalogue number. These were catalogue numbers 1, 2 and 3, and the first of those was Duck Shoot, which is basically a clone of the arcade game Carnival. It was programmed by Sean Southern. It was credited to Shuttlesoft, which I assume was a name for their company that they later changed to Mr. Chip Software. It's very well programmed, good clone of Carnival, but there's no originality to it at all. It's basically an exact copy of Carnival. And following that was Vegas Jackpot, which is not one of the better Mr. Chip Software games in all honesty. This was the second release based on catalogue number, although all 3 of the games I'm talking about at the moment all came out in April 1984. It's again, there's nothing wrong with the programming on it, it's just really boring. There's no point playing a fruit machine simulator if you can't actually win any money. Again, this one was credited to Shuttlesoft and programmed by Sean Southern. Very nicely programmed, but not a lot of point in playing it in all honesty. And the third of those early releases was by Tony Kelly, and that's called Squirm. And Squirm is a little bit more original than the other 2 games. It's a variant of Pac-Man. You move around a maze picking up little objects that are left behind by the snakes that run around the maze. And it's graphics wise and sound wise, it's not very good. It's kind of Pac-Man meets Snake, and it's playable but not a spectacular game. Of those 3 early games, probably 2 of them were worth paying the $1.99 asking price for. As I said, all 3 pretty well programmed, but nothing really to write home about. Just clones of existing arcade games, which were obviously pretty common in that era of games being released. In July 1984, a second wave of releases were put out by Mastertronic, and including them was another Mr. Chip Software offering. This one was Spectipede, again programmed by Tony Kelly, and you can probably tell by the graphics on it, very similar to Squirm and these little sort of almost ASCII art style graphics. And it's pretty obviously a Centipede clone. It's again reasonably playable clone, nothing too terrible about it, but also nothing great to write home about, just about worth the $1.99 asking price. And following that was a release by Mr. Chip that you're probably not that familiar with, even if you've been following my videos or following the sort of Mastertronic releases. Mastertronic released a free cassette which contained a game written by Tony Kelly from Mr. Chip Software, therefore, entitled Aqua. And the game's a pretty simplistic kind of platform where you've got to dive under the sea, collect pearls and then get back up to the boat before your air runs out. It's a pretty nice little game, and it does have a 2-player option, simultaneous 2-player game, and it's definitely more original than any of the prior games, but there's definitely a style already that you can see in these games, particularly for Tony Kelly. Kind of a crude graphical style, but in all his games playability is always pretty good. So overall, for the first 5 Mr. Chip Software releases, nothing amazing to talk about, but they're all well programmed, they're all probably about worth the $1.99, and Aqua was certainly worth picking up as a freebie. From that point on, things did start to improve. During 1985 there was a number of very good releases from Mr. Chip Software. Commencing with Big Mac the Mad Maintenance Man, another Tony Kelly offering. I covered this in my top 10 recently, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it's a really good puzzle platformer. Again, it's got the basic graphic style and not great music, but it is very playable, and it's, in my opinion, Tony Kelly's best game from the Mastertronic era, which if you'd watched my top 10 recently, you'd know that already. Next up is one of the Breakout releases from Mr. Chip Software, one of the best Mastertronic games up to this point, and one that really showed that Mr. Chip Software were a company to be relied on for decent games for the $1.99 price point. That game is Sean Southern's Kickstart. I'm sure you've already seen my coverage of Kickstart 2 recently, but the original game was much along the same lines. It's a motocross racing game for 1 or 2 players simultaneous. There's no computer player option in this one. It's only got 8 tracks in compared to the multitude of tracks available in the later one, and they're almost too challenging in places. Some of them, if you fall off early on, you've got next to no chance of actually even participating in most of the track. The graphics and sound are pretty good, not as good as the sequel again, but overall it was a decent release at that point in time, and it showed several elements of games from Sean Southern that would become commonplace. Things like the scrolling text on the intro screen, the sort of user interface was quite similar where you pick different tracks and so on. You'll see that again in some of the later ones. And it also started to show its sort of fascination, if you like, with games to do with driving and racing and so on, which would be prevalent throughout the rest of his programming career. The next game released by Mr. Chip Software was the Hero of the Golden Talisman, which again I've covered recently in my top 10, so I'm not going to go into too much detail on over and above what I've already said, other than to say it's a really good flick screen action platform adventure game, nice inventory system, very challenging game, and that was released in October 1985. It was an early MAD release, and I think the reason it was chosen as a MAD release at a $2.99 price point was probably because it was certainly more expansive than any of the previous games released by Mr. Chip. It's a game that you can't play through in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes. You've definitely got to spend some time with. Following that, in May 1986, was another Sean Southern game, and his first proper sort of into the screen racing game. That was Formula 1 Simulator. Presentation's a bit lacking on this one. There's no title screen or anything like that, but what you do get is a multiple number of tracks to race on. Very good programming and graphics, but it's got a bit of a strange scoring method for a driving game. It's not really an actual racing game. You don't race against anyone. Basically, you just try and get as high a score as possible. There's also no track overview in the corner of the screen, and not even a finish line marking, so it is a bit of a peculiar one. But that said, it's still certainly playable and well worth the $1.99 asking price, and is actually one of the highest selling Mastertronic games of all time on the Commodore 64. Moving on to February 1987, and 2 more Sean Southern games. The first of those is the one that's on the screen behind me, POD Proof of Destruction. Again, I've covered this in my top 10 fairly comprehensively, so I'll move on to the second of the 2 releases, which was Laser Wheel. This is the only really dud game from the whole of the Mr. Chip lineup. Of all the games they released, this is the one that's really no fun, boring to play. It's presented and programmed pretty well, as you'd expect for a Mr. Chip game. But this one was interestingly designed by someone called PK Petriv, which may explain why it's not actually as good as the other Mr. Chip games. This could have just been basically a programmer for hire job, and it's really kind of just a dull game where you just rotate around and shoot colourful blocks. Not a lot of fun at all. Later on in 1987 was another Tony Kelly release, Video Meanies. This one's an interesting flick screen action adventure. You've got to basically move around and deactivate video screens. It introduces some interesting sort of mini games where each time you get to a video screen, you have to either gamble to try and get an extra life, or effectively you lose a life if you mess it up. That's something that was also present in a later Tony Kelly game. We'll get to that in a moment. The graphics are a lot better for a Tony Kelly game in this one. The main character's quite cute. The enemies are really frustrating. They bounce around all over the place and you lose a lot of lives really quickly. Definitely a challenging game, even though you've only got 24 screens to progress through. And again, well programmed, interesting, challenging, and definitely worth the money that they were asking for it. Following that was the classic Kickstart 2 from Sean Southern. This is, as I've already mentioned, is the best value and the best game on the Commodore 64 from Mastertronic. it vastly improves on the original game, and if you want to know more about it, then basically check out my review from a month or so back, or even just the top 10 as I go into a lot more detail about it then. It's basically a really brilliant game that you just have to play if you haven't already played it before. And this was actually the last release by Sean Southern for Mastertronic, as Mr. Chip started to develop games for other publishers. There was, however, one last game for Mastertronic from Tony Kelly via Mr. Chip Software, and that was Roll Around. Again, in keeping with Tony Kelly's style, it's a more cerebral game than a Sean Southern game. It's a kind of action puzzle game, I think is the best way to describe it, with an isometric perspective. Basically, you've got to move around and collect a certain number of different coloured items on each stage. It can be really frustrating because the control mechanism makes it a little bit tricky to jump over the gaps. Sometimes you'll jump more than you intend to and kill yourself off, and the whole screen resets when you do that. That said, it is quite an interesting game, quite good fun once you get into it and get used to that control scheme. Definitely gets the mind working a bit, and that was Tony Kelly's last game for Mastertronic. He went on to do some more games for Mr. Chip on alternative software. Sean Southern, meanwhile, was working on a game called Trailblazer for Gremlin Graphics, and just when you thought there was no more Mr. Chip games to come from Mastertronic, he actually got that re-released by Mastertronic on the Ricochet packaging. So Trailblazer was actually the last Mr. Chip game to be released by Mastertronic. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great game, and in a way it's kind of a 3D version of Kickstart. It's got the same sort of split screen presentation. The way you select the tracks by picking a letter from like A to X or whatever it is quite similar. It's got the same sort of difficult surfaces to go over, where you've got to go slow over some of them, jump over some of them. So yeah, kind of like a 3D racing version of Kickstart, albeit with a more kind of esoteric presentation. So that sums up the games released by Mr. Chip Software for Mastertronic. Just to mention Andrew Morris, who did do the graphics on Kickstart too, and he also did the title screens for several games, which we'll just have a quick look through now. As you can see, definite similarities between them. There's a definite graphical style to Andrew Morris's work. They were pretty nice as well, just added something a little bit extra to the games. And what happened after their period of time with Mastertronic was they went on to do work for alternative software and Gremlin Graphics, as I've mentioned, and eventually they moved into 16-bit development, and Mr. Chip Software turned into Magnetic Fields, and they continued that sort of fascination with driving and racing games with the Supercars and Lotus Turbo Challenge series on the Amiga, Mega Drive and so on. They then went on to do more Formula 1 and motor racing style games on other 16-bit platforms. So what did Mr. Chip Software bring to Mastertronic? Well, in summary, you bought a Mr. Chip game, you were guaranteed one thing, which is good programming. The graphics weren't always best, the sounds weren't always great, but you always got a good game, playable, usually pretty fair, albeit challenging, and always a pretty good sign of quality. If you saw it was by Mr. Chip Software on the back of the cover, you could be pretty sure you were going to get a good game, unless it was Laser Wheel, really. So just to sum up, what value were they to Mastertronic? Well, just on the Commodore 64 alone, their titles sold over 730,000 copies, and 3 of the games, the 2 Kickstart games and the Formula 1 simulator, they were all in the top 10 best-selling games of all time on the Commodore 64 from Mastertronic. So in summary, Mr. Chip Software, a real great developer for Mastertronic, and definitely an integral part of the success of Mastertronic, and a guarantee of quality on virtually every game that they produced.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
2, 1, 0.